how to learn so fast, so efficiently. Nearly everyone believes learning depends mostly on intelligence. But decades of neuroscience suggest something very different. The speed at which you learn is determined less by how powerful your brain is and more by how efficiently your brain changes itself. That distinction matters because every time you understand a new idea, your brain is physically reorganizing billions of connections between neurons. Learning isn't simply collecting information, it's controlled biological change. Most people try to learn by adding more hours. Research suggests the real question is how much of those hours actually produce lasting change. That's where the science becomes fascinating. Learning begins with attention. Your brain receives millions of pieces of information every second, yet only a tiny fraction reaches conscious awareness. The rest is filtered out by networks in the frontal and parietal regions of the brain that decide what deserves processing. Attention is the brain's gatekeeper. If attention never locks onto something, memory never gets the chance to form. This helps explain why reading 10 pages while checking your phone every few minutes often feels productive, but produces surprisingly little retention. Every interruption forces the brain to rebuild its mental context, consuming energy that could have strengthened memory instead. Psychologists call this attention residue. After switching tasks, part of your attention remains attached to the previous activity, reducing performance on the next one. Research by Sophie Leroy demonstrated that even brief task switching leaves behind a cognitive cost that makes deep learning significantly less efficient. But attention alone isn't enough. The brain also has to decide whether information is worth keeping. This is where dopamine enters the story. Many people think dopamine is the brain's pleasure chemical. That's only partly true. Modern neuroscience shows dopamine functions more like a prediction signal. It tells your brain that something important has happened and that paying attention may improve future outcomes. When curiosity is activated before learning, dopamine levels increase in brain circuits connected to the hippocampus, the structure primarily responsible for forming new memories. Studies led by neuroscientist Matthias Gruber found that people remembered information significantly better when their curiosity had first been stimulated, even when the information itself wasn't directly related to what made them curious. Curiosity literally prepares the brain for learning. That's why asking a meaningful question before reading often works better than simply opening the textbook. Your brain becomes ready to search for an answer. Another misconception involves repetition. Repeating something over and over feels productive because familiarity increases. But familiarity isn't the same as learning. Research in cognitive psychology consistently shows that retrieval practice, forcing yourself to recall information from memory, is far more effective than rereading it. Every successful retrieval strengthens the neural pathways associated with that memory. Psychologist Henry Roediger and colleagues demonstrated that testing yourself isn't merely a way to measure learning. It actually creates learning. The act of remembering changes the brain. Timing matters too. Many people cram because it feels efficient. The problem is biological. When information is reviewed repeatedly over several days instead of one long session, the brain repeatedly rebuilds and strengthens the same neural pathways. This process, known as spaced repetition, takes advantage of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to modify its own wiring through experience. Instead of one large construction project, the brain performs several smaller renovations. The final structure becomes stronger. Sleep is another overlooked ingredient. During deep sleep, especially slow-wave sleep, the hippocampus repeatedly replays patterns of neural activity formed during the day. Researchers using brain imaging have observed this replay process, suggesting that temporary memories are gradually transferred into more stable networks across the cortex. In simple terms, your brain studies while you're asleep. Skipping sleep doesn't simply make you tired. It interrupts memory consolidation itself. This explains why students who sleep after studying often outperform students who continue studying late into the night. Learning continues even after the books are closed. Stress also changes the equation. A small amount of stress sharpens attention. Too much does the opposite. When cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, remains elevated for long periods, communication between the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex becomes less efficient. Robert Sapolsky's work has shown that chronic stress can interfere with memory formation, attention, and cognitive flexibility. The brain shifts its priorities. Instead of investing energy in learning, it prepares for survival. That's useful during emergencies. It's not useful during exams. Perhaps the most surprising finding comes from something called desirable difficulty. The phrase sounds contradictory, yet research by psychologists Robert and Elizabeth Bjork shows that learning methods that feel harder often produce stronger long-term retention. Struggling to retrieve an answer, explaining an idea in your own words, mixing different problem types instead of repeating identical ones. These techniques feel slower because your brain is working harder. Ironically, that extra effort produces more durable learning. Easy isn't always efficient. Difficulty, when carefully managed, signals that the brain is actively reorganizing itself. This changes how you should think about intelligence. Fast learners aren't necessarily people with exceptional memory. They're often people whose habits align with how memory naturally works. They protect attention instead of fragmenting it. They generate curiosity before collecting information. They retrieve instead of rereading. They space practice instead of cramming. They sleep instead of sacrificing recovery. And they understand that brief moments of productive struggle aren't signs of failure. They're signs of adaptation. Perhaps that's the deepest lesson modern neuroscience offers. Learning isn't about forcing your brain to absorb more information. It's about creating the biological conditions that allow your brain to rewire itself efficiently. The remarkable discovery isn't that your brain can change. Scientists have known that for decades. The remarkable discovery is that every focused question, every successful retrieval, every night of quality sleep, and every carefully spaced review quietly reshapes the physical architecture of your mind. Once you understand that learning is a biological process rather than a measure of talent, the question is no longer how smart you are. The question becomes how skillfully you're helping your brain become smarter.